And I see that very much in this piece itself compared to this one, which had required less stability and more just in a single station area, except for the grinding stone, because his motors were actually set on the other side. He would actually physically have to remove himself and move on to that as well too. They were very much uniformed in style as he did that, but as you see on these bigger turquoise, it required a lot more than that. Not only did it require the shaping of the stone itself from the main motors and stuff, then he would go back to his workstation to where all the files were at, and it used the files to incise these the patterns of the leaf into it. So he had to physically do that, because once he got the shape, then after the stamping and everything was soldered on, then he would place the piece over it. This vine that we see, which we think is a vine, would actually be lifted a little bit higher, and then the stone will be set in place. Then it will press that vine down onto the leaf itself, because it would have already been soldered in there. All it had to be done was need to press it in place, and that's what he would do. But again, from moving from one station to another required that kind of mobility, and which was pretty much incorporated into a piece like this as well too. So I think this was very indicative of his ability to move around. Again, that's something that wasn't very well understood, or really haven't been talked about, is how their personal lives affect the designs of some of his works that he created, either at the time when he was going through recovery, and a time when he was much better and was much more mobile in a sense too. So I think these two pieces really demonstrate that well. The other aspects of this that I haven't got a chance to talk about too much, and it's probably within a lot of his pieces post 1945, when he married my mother, and that my mother was actually part of a lot of his artwork as well too. She did a lot of the initially a lot of the lapidary aspects of the pieces. She shaped and cut a number of the stones for the placement of it, and that would be her part in helping him create his art pieces. But I do not know what amount of work that my mother actually incorporated to either of these two pieces, but they both actually worked jointly to create a number of these elements as well too. And that's also a very unrecognized understanding of what really, the absence of what part my mother really took part in this. And after a while, she was able to do a lot of the soldering herself. The whole creation of what my father had been, what work has been attributed to my father. And so after his death, my mother actually did do the same type of work in a number of different areas, either for pieces like this, or more the contemporary work that he was doing at the time in the late 1960s. She did most of it on her own as well too, but it would never be recognized as my mother's work. It would always be recognized as my father's work, which was a really unrecognizable work that she did. And to this day, I do not have any idea of how many of those pieces existed that was made purely by my mother alone, but never really received the recognition for it too. This is another set that I chose to talk about as well too, mainly to illustrate probably to underscore what we don't do very often anymore in Zuni and Zuni jewelry making, is collaboration of work. This piece is in particular of Dan Simplicio and Oman Lika, and how they connected with one another is probably the better understanding of the times back then, simply because our relationships were very strong in my father's generation. That had a lot to do with the fact that we were still living in the context of extended families in Zuni. After 1970s, when we started moving into government housings, that's the first time we actually start becoming nuclear families ourselves. Actually, in Dan's family was one of the very first families in Zuni that was actually in a nuclear family setting. It was just my mom and my dad and the rest of my siblings. Our grandmother was next door, and we still had a close relationship despite the fact that we were actually a nuclear family and that our household didn't include my grandmother or my great-grandmother. But they lived right next door, so it was always a close relationship, just broken up. But normally in that sense, you're actually living with your mother-in-law or your grandmother-in-law, and they're the ones who set the social rules and the social order of the household. And I think Dan was absent of that. But nevertheless, there was still a very close relationship. Geographically today, when we see people much further apart from one another and in communities that are outlying Zuni itself, at least about 2 miles away, but there clearly is a geographical distance between people now, as much as it was back in my father's generation. And so it was much more of a tighter community. It's still a very close community, and because of that close relationship and the real importance of having relationships in Zuni was very critical back then.